So if you're willing, I'd like to ask you, Jason Aster, what is the biggest risk?
In my little space, the biggest risk is willful blindness to what you should be paying for your lease. You spend a lot of money and time getting into these major leases, hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, brokerage, millions in brokerage fees, depending on what party you are. FF&E fit out fee, $200 a square foot, a huge amount of money getting into them. I think you mentioned this before. It should be your duty, if you're going to spend this amount of resource to get into it, to make sure you're getting what you're supposed to out of it. So the biggest risk is just being willfully blind and not having an expert just look at it behind the scenes. The interesting thing about risk in our space, and kind of in relation to the way you described your day-to-day work, is operating expense pass-throughs is a risk adjustment. That's what it is. The landlords back in the 70s, they just charged rent like a lease when you were a kid in an apartment. Like you paid your rent and they factored in some amount into it. And then one day, their insurance policies went up. There was a fire somewhere. Well, now the rent's not enough. What do? You got to pass it through. You have to shift the risk. Operating expense theory is a shifting of the risk. The landlords have said, back in the 70s, it's too much risk. Look, think about all the things. Inflation is happening too fast. Rent's not enough. I don't have the ability to jack my rent up. In my insurance policy, taxes are going up, right? The union bargained for something, right? 32 BJ in New York bargained for, better fringe benefits. And now I have to pay that. I have to figure out how to reallocate the risk of operating my building across my tenant basis because I can't bear it anymore. That's what operating expenses are. They're an adjustment of risk. What's happening now from a risk perspective, other than just please don't bury your head in the sand and just pay whatever the landlord tells you, is inflation. How do you avoid inflation? It's hard in a lease because leases happen one time and then you sit in them, right? In your world, insurance, landlords pay a fortune, as you know, for insurance. And they have every right to pass that through. Guess what they can't control? The cost of insurance. So if inflation increases the cost of insurance, or some pandemic increases the cost of insurance, or some environmental thing, they got to pass that through. So that's considered an uncontrollable cost, right? Landlords can't control insurance. They can't control taxes. They can't really control, within reason, the amount of money they spend for utilities. So when you negotiate a lease, landlords will fight, as they should, to say, I can't control these things. We're going to call them costs I can't control. You just got to pay your pro rata share. It is what it is. I'm not going to fluff it up. I'm not going to put a percentage on top of it. So if I pay $1 for insurance and you have half my building, I'm passing through 50 cents to you. And that's fair. The other bucket of things, all of the other things, cleaning, security, right? Certain common use of things, that is controllable. Who you hire, what rate you pay for it, what it costs to manage your building. It's big numbers sometimes. Those are controllable expenses. And that's where tenants can start to adjust their risk, including caps to, cap inflation, right? If inflation is causing the rise of payroll is going up in the CPIs, and going crazy, what do? Well, if I think about it in advance, I go, inflation is usually around 4 to 5%. What if I cap some of these costs that the landlord can control? Now I'm adjusting my risk because I don't have to worry that if we hit a hyperinflationary period, that I'm ever going to pay more than this 5% cap on these costs. Now, this is only fair to a landlord if these are costs the landlord can purportedly control. And that's the rub, right? That's where you need lawyers. How do you argue what's controllable? If I'm a landlord, I would go, I can't control payroll. I'm in a union state. They tell me. Pretty good argument. I would call BS, but if you're a tenant and you're not well represented, you go, you're right, you can't control payroll, right? But there's all these really interesting nuances, and it's all about shifting risk. It's all about shifting the risk of operating one way or another. And the bigger and badder the tenant, the less risk they're going to assume, and the more they're going to push back on the landlord. And in today's market, landlords are happy to have tenants. So you will see, if you are a company looking to negotiate a lease, maybe you're negotiating a smaller one, but you're still negotiating, you might actually have an opportunity to adjust shift some of the risk back to the landlord in the operating costs of your lease. That's what I would say. And the landlords are going to do the opposite. right? Rents are going down in some markets. This is an insane market, right? You can go to the middle of Manhattan and rents have never been higher, commercial office rents. One Vanderbilt, Hudson Yards, one Manhattan West. You're talking about $250 a square foot. People are gobbling it up. 3 blocks over on 3rd Avenue, can't give it away for free. Crazy, right? So if you're a landlord and you happen to have great product, you're pushing the risk to your tenant. You want to be in here. Right? If you have a half-empty building that was built in 1976 and nobody wants to be there, it's a free-for-all.